Okay, continuing beyond Roger Schmittner's book. This is now beginning of March 2022. This is the first. Just yesterday, end of February, IPCC released its Working Group 2 report, which is in a draft form, but the summary for policymakers is final. And it's called Impacts, Adaptation and Vulnerability. So you can see it's approved here. So IPCC Working Group 2 Sixth Assessment Report. I'm just going to summarize the main figures again, remembering again that IPCC uses terminologies about the confidence levels being very low, low, medium, high, very high, and it in this chapter, of course, it has definitions for hazards like climate hazards, which have the ability to perturb life, cause damages to individuals, property, and so on. Vulnerability, which is the susceptibility of people exposed to these hazards, and vulnerability may depend on the individuals, the communities. For example, in the same city, when a heat wave comes, the slums and the poor neighborhoods will be more vulnerable than the people who are living in good buildings with air conditioning and so on, or people who have to rely on public transportation versus those who have their own transportation, etc. And exposure is where you are in the face of a hazard that is coming at you. Depends on infrastructure, population density, and other things. There are formal definitions. I'm just introducing you to the concept since this is a basic course. And risk is often seen as a combination of hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. Okay, so here, from climate risk to climate resilient development, climate ecosystems including biodiversity and human society as coupled systems. So the risk propeller here shows that risk emerges from the overlap of climate hazards, vulnerability, and exposure. So these vulnerability and exposure of human systems, ecosystems, and their biodiversity are taken together. Here the main interactions and trends are looked at to see options to reduce climate risks and establish resilience. Resilience is the concept of how quickly you can recover from a shock, okay, of the ecosystem or of human systems. So how do we think about it? Here again are the risks which, as I said, are seen as a combination of hazards, exposure, and vulnerability. So here is human society with its limits to adaptation, losses, and damages. So it is increasing greenhouse gases through its emissions, which is causing climate change. So causes, impacts, and risks of climate change are important, and the impacts on human beings depends on how the human society adapts, sometimes adapts, which means you do something that you think is preparing you for change in climate, extreme events, sea level rise, and so on, but actually you have made a miscalculation and it makes you more vulnerable to some of those hazards. And mitigates. So obviously we are talking about renewable energy, bioenergy, policies, and various other ways in which we are trying to mitigate our impact on climate change and the environment. Human society then also impacts ecosystems, including biodiversity, which have their own limits to adaptation, losses, and damages, because some ecosystems respond better. Some species, for example, respond better to rapid changes in temperature or humidity or precipitation. Some others don't. But the ecosystems and biodiversity are also affected by human impact on climate change. So they also adapt to and mitigate climate change, depending on whether it's a positive feedback or negative feedback in the system of climate change and ecosystem, including biodiversity. Okay, so humans also try to conserve and restore, manage, protect, and so on the ecosystems and biodiversity under various international agreements, various national efforts, various NGOs, and so on. And then there is provision. Ecosystems and biodiversity also offer provisions, livelihoods, and ecosystem services. From urgent and timely action, governance, finance, knowledge, capacity, catalyzing conditions, and technologies, we can impact future climate change in terms of limiting global warming. So human system transitions in terms of societal transitions, our living ways, our carbon footprint per person, per capita, and so on, energy, industry, urban and rural, and infrastructures can affect in terms of adapting to or mitigating future climate change, which then can reduce its impacts on human societies, which of course can also reduce impact on ecosystem transitions, which include land, freshwater, coastal, ocean ecosystems, and their biodiversity. We can also increase our efforts to conserve, restore ecosystems, and of course ecosystem-based approaches are developed, advocated, tested, and modeled to look at the beneficial effects we can have on ecosystems. And of course the provisioning with livelihoods, ecosystems, and services continues, and you can see the arrows here looking thicker, because if we increase this effort and reduce this effort, then we can gain more returns, as well as adapt to and mitigate the ability of the ecosystems and ecosystem transitions to adapt to and mitigate climate change can be enhanced, and impact of future climate change on ecosystems and biodiversity can be reduced. So that could lead to a climate resilient development, human health and well-being, equity and justice, ecosystem health, and planetary health. Planetary health is this concept where human health depends on a concept of ecosystem health. So the more healthy the ecosystem is, which doesn't have a very unique definition, but it is considered parallel to human health in terms of vital signs. You can think of it as complexity of the ecosystem in terms of biodiversity, its total productivity in terms of how everybody is functioning at optimal level in the ecosystem, and resilience, how the ecosystem can recover from shocks from climate change and other natural hazards, maybe like earthquakes and so on and so forth. Okay, so maybe I should stop this introduction here. The report looks at impacts of climate change into ecosystems and human systems worldwide at global scale, which has typically more studies, more data, and more robust findings, whereas regional studies, not looking at national level but continents like Africa and Asia, Australasia, and regions like the Arctic and tropical forests, Mediterranean regions, and so on, and looking at terrestrial, freshwater, and ocean ecosystem structures and changes in them, species range shifts due to warming and other changes, could be change in mountain ranges or latitudinal ranges, and changes in the phenologies, timings of spring blooms, growth seasons, and so on. So terrestrial, freshwater, and ocean systems are looked at as well. So since this is a bit detailed, let me come back to that in the next podcast and leave this introduction to the IPCC AR6 report on impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. Okay.